All right, and we are joined by former Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco. Governor Blanco, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to start by taking you back to early August of 2005. At this point, you'd been in office for a little over 18 months, in addition to having served 8 years as Lieutenant Governor. Having spent all that time at the highest levels of state government, having seen the state deal with multiple hurricanes through both tenures, what was your opinion of the plan that the state had in place at the time?
I thought that it had been an improved plan because during Governor Foster's term we had a threat of a hurricane that did not materialize, but it did. It was a significant enough threat that an evacuation process had been designed to use contraflow and to open both sides of the interstate to outbound traffic. So when I became governor in the very first summer, we did have another hurricane that threatened us, and we used the existing plan. The hurricane did not hit Louisiana, but it actually was not a comprehensive enough plan to evacuate the area of New Orleans, and lots of people got caught on the interstate. We had traffic jams, unbelievable traffic jams, and so I asked my people to go back to the drawing board, build on the existing contraflow plan, and make it work better. That meant not allowing people to, once they got to Baton Rouge, to try to get back on I-10, but to move them to like Highway 190 instead. And the Interstate 10 had just become like a parking lot. Nobody was moving. There was so many cars trying to get on there. So we redesigned the contraflow plan, and we felt pretty secure about being able to evacuate that metropolitan area, which included a lot of very low-lying areas with one road in and one road out in Plaquemine and St. Bernard parishes. Our new plan actually worked beautifully. I watched it from helicopters. We saw the cars being diverted as people chose their destinations, and we evacuated approximately 1.3 million people before the hurricane out of a region, not just the city, but a region of 1.4 million people. So we had done some pre-planning that was absolutely a good thing and worked quite well.
You speak about the contraflow. You know, in late August, Katrina moves through the Atlantic, gets into the Gulf. At what point did you decide, okay, we're going to put the mechanisms of state government into motion and start preparing the preparations?
We were all watching the National Weather Service from the Hurricane Center. And the hurricane was lulling us into believing that it was not going to come to Louisiana. Early in the week, it was headed to Florida. It was almost definitive. Every model was showing Florida. Then as a few days went on, then Alabama became part of the target area. So Alabama and Florida around Pensacola looked like they were going to be impacted. Then later on, as the week moved on, each day, the predictions moved toward us. It became Alabama and Mississippi, and then Mississippi and Louisiana on Friday afternoon before the hurricane. That is when Louisiana was first projected to take a hit from Hurricane Katrina. I immediately, the minute I learned that we were going to be considered in the cone of influence, immediately signed an emergency declaration and activated our Office of Emergency Preparedness and began calls. I had taken a quick trip to Lafayette to do a few things because that's where my home is. And on the way back, all of my plans were shifted. I abandoned my Lafayette plans and went immediately back to Baton Rouge. And on the way in, I listened to the first round of calls from the emergency center with all of the local parish officials of the parishes that we thought were most likely to be involved. So on Friday afternoon before the storm, we were very much engaged, and I actually had the declaration being worked on when I arrived in Baton Rouge before the 6 o'clock news. We had it signed and out and sent to all the media who announced it at that point in time.
And you speak about the media. At a press conference you had in Jefferson Parish on Saturday, August 27th, you said, quote, "I feel that we are really prepared. That's the one thing I've always been able to brag about." When you said that, did you firmly believe that all the state's resources were in place and we were aptly prepared for what this storm could bring?
all of the state's resources were definitely in place, as much as we could command. We had a large number of our National Guard members away in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we had a big chunk of our available personnel not really here in Louisiana. But we did have still a strong force. We had all of our pieces together. After all, we had weathered many hurricanes of the past, and we knew pretty much what to do. We just did not plan or adequately have enough personnel to deal with the abject flooding that happened into the city of New Orleans when those levees broke.
On the Sunday before Katrina, moving on actually into New Orleans, you appeared with Mayor Nagin as he announced the first mandatory evacuation in the history of the city of New Orleans. At the time, the city's population was approximately 484,000. Were you confident that those who could leave the city by their own means, you earlier mentioned contraflow, would, and that the city would be able to securely house those who stayed in the Superdome and the Convention Center?
I was hoping that the city could be evacuated 100%, which is obviously not a very realistic hope or expectation. But I would have liked to have seen the city emptied completely, and that was my goal. I traveled into New Orleans on Saturday. I had two press conferences, one in Jefferson Parish and one in Orleans Parish on Saturday, and again on Sunday morning as the final push to try to get the final folks who were making decisions at that point, most of them leaning towards staying. We were trying to get those last people out. And there was, adequate transportation. There were a lot of things that could happen. The highways were clear. It was not going to be a difficult journey because the big part of the evacuation had already happened on Saturday in particular and early Sunday morning. But we were just trying to get the very last people out, give them as much warning as possible to get to safety. And unfortunately, I'd say about 60,000 people chose not to leave or could not leave. There were two levels of decision making there, some who couldn't and some who wouldn't. And then we had another 30 or 40,000 people who absolutely had to stay in the region because of their jobs. We had doctors and nurses in the hospitals, and we had very ill patients in the hospitals. In the past, the hospital's evacuation plan was evacuate in place. They would send anyone home who was able to go home, but keep the sickest of the sick there, and then also tend to emergency needs for the people who are working to clear debris and get injured and things like that. So we had people in hotels who got stranded, so the hotel workers really had to stay. The airlines quit flying on Saturday instead of allowing empty planes to come in on Sunday to evacuate tourists who got caught in our hotels because every rental was out. There was no transportation, public transportation that these individual folks could find. So and probably about 3,000 people were in the hotels, and probably 1,000 people or more were in the hospitals. And then, we had residents who might not have had transportation, or they chose to stay. They didn't think it was going to be serious. They just wouldn't listen. But no, I was not confident that we would have a 100% evacuation. I was hoping we could, but I didn't have that confidence. I knew we'd have some problems.
In documents your office has released since the hurricane, we now know that shortly before you went out to speak with Mayor Nagin to encourage the citizens to leave, you had a phone conversation with the president. Knowing that you and the mayor were about to issue the evacuation order, what did the president say to you?
Well, the president called to say that Max Mayfield from the Hurricane Weather Center had called him to say that it was going to be one of the most dangerous hurricanes of our times. And the president called to say that he was there to help. He was very concerned. And in that conversation, I told him, Mr. President, we're really going to need your help. In fact, we're going to need every single asset that you have. We're going to need all you've got. And, he called to say, I'm encouraging you to order a mandatory evacuation. And I said, Mr. President, The mayor and I are walking out this minute. I stopped to take your phone call, but we are about to issue that order. The mayor technically was under the legal obligation to, has that legal responsibility. And I was backing the mayor. And so I told him, I said, the mayor and I are getting ready to walk out to issue a mandatory evacuation. And he said, well, I'm glad to hear that. And I said, well, we've taken this very seriously, and this will help with the final people who could possibly leave. We hope. So we did walk out, and the mayor issued a mandatory evacuation for Orleans Parish. And, we talked about everyone in the entire region considering evacuating. They had to get out. But again, there were public officials who felt like they had to stay in their parishes and weather the storm. And many people put their own lives in danger with their personal decisions.
Was there a delay at all between the bureaucracy of speaking with the president, Mayor Nagin, and ordering the evacuation of the city? Was there any delay?
No, that was, we had a planned evacuation, a pre-planned evacuation program. And it was a staged evacuation. That was the other part of the contraflow replanning. We planned for the low-lying regions like Plaquemine and St. Bernard Parish to leave first. And so the emphasis was on those regions getting out, because what had happened before is all the people coming from the south would get jammed up into the traffic in New Orleans, and then nobody could move. So we wanted the low-lying regions not to get caught on the highways in the middle of a hurricane, and that was pre-planned. And then the urban centers would follow suit. It had to be staged that way, and all of the parish leaders had signed on the dotted line saying that they knew this was a sensible way to do it. It was a little unnerving for some in the end. Jefferson Parish wanted to call for the evacuation sooner, but it worked. When everybody just held to the plan, it actually worked quite well.
So I want to move on from the preparations for the hurricane that you went through, and the storm made its landfall on the morning of August 29th, 2005. Now, before you receive any information about the levee situation in New Orleans, before that situation becomes apparent, what were the biggest crises and decisions that you were dealing with?
We were trying to evaluate the impact of the storm, and everyone around us who had immediate access to information took a deep breath, and it said, well, it looked like we survived. There was some flooding in some areas, always to be expected, because we have a city that's under sea level, and easily underwater. So we knew that was going to happen. That's why we had Wildlife and Fisheries boats ready to go, National Guard boats ready to go. We had high water trucks. We had some equipment. All the equipment that the state could command was ready and available to move in to action. Actually, they did on the Monday evening as the storm winds died down, but still we had gale force winds. Our boats were in the waters already, trying to find the people who had made a bad decision or who were compromised because of their own health or their own ability. So we marshaled all of our forces and immediately started rescue missions on Monday evening as the storm winds were dying down.
At what point did you learn, throughout this whole process, did you learn about the levee situation in New Orleans, and what was your immediate reaction?
It was later on Monday afternoon that we did learn that the 17th Street Canal, the walls of the canal were weakening, and the mayor called me and he was panicking. Mayor Nagin called me and he was in a panic state and said, you've got to get the National Guard to drop sandbags in there to stop the breach. The city itself, downtown New Orleans, is going to flood if that breach isn't shored up. I immediately called for National Guard help. They pulled a bunch of helicopters together and started dropping 3-ton bags of sand into the breach. And the general called me, and General Landrieu, head of the National Guard, called me and said, Governor, he said, our 3-ton bags are just falling into the waters. And he said, and it's like nothing. He said, it's so deep, the breach is so deep. He said, we're not doing any good. He said, we have to halt our operations and shift to get 10,000-pound bags up at a time if we're going to do any good. But it was already too late when that notice came, and it was an impossible thing to stop, because it certainly had taken on so much pressure from the lake waters and from the pumps trying to push water out of the city, that the breach was of such magnitude that it did flood the city, the downtown area of New Orleans.
So the storm hits on Monday, the levees break in the afternoon, the city's starting to fill with water. On Tuesday morning, where were you at personally and emotionally?
Well, on Tuesday morning, we were definitely making an attempt to assess the situation. I went up in a helicopter and flew over the entire region. It was the most startling thing to see. When we got to Jefferson Parish, thousands of homes were already underwater because of other breaches all along the way. And Jefferson Parish into Orleans, and you could tell that the floodwaters were getting deeper and deeper, because you could see some of the houses in Jefferson Parish. You could see where the water stopped, maybe at 2 feet. But as you got into Orleans, all you saw was rooftops. And there were people on many, many rooftops all through this area. It was the most awful thing that I've ever witnessed. An incredible level of destruction that one could hardly figure out adequate words to describe. And I saw boats already moving through the channels. We had our wildlife and fisheries agents were moving through these very treacherous areas, because you must remember power lines were down. Gas was bubbling up from houses that had been stripped from their moorings. And so we could see water bubbling in different locations. It was very hot. It was August, like now, and it was an eerie scene to be flying over this, to assess the damage, to see just how widespread the damage was. And the damage did not end. It started out to be blocks and blocks, and then it was miles and miles and miles of homes that were destroyed. It was unrelenting, that level of devastation. I don't think that I know we were not prepared to see nearly 100% destruction of every building and every home. And in St. Bernard Parish, every single property was underwater, had taken on significant levels of water damage, some 10 and 12 feet high. In Orleans, there were places with 8 and 10 feet of water where you could just see the rooftops of the homes. So that's what you saw. You saw water and rooftops. And then on many of these houses, you saw people on top of the roofs. And then as Wednesday came into play, we began to see more helicopter rescues. So the air became kind of a treacherous place. Communications networks were down, and there were no towers up to direct air traffic. So helicopter pilots started coming in to do rescue missions. The Coast Guard was among those. The National Guard brought in as many helicopters as they could gather up. And they were doing miraculous rescue missions. As it turned out, in the dome itself, about 10 or 12,000 people had spent the night of the hurricane in the dome. But by Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, we had more like it was growing. We had more like 20,000 and 30,000 people at the end of the day had to be rescued, had to be evacuated from the Superdome itself. So that facility was truly overloaded with people because the roof had shorn, and it was not a good place anymore to house anybody. But there they were, you know, as rescue teams were pulling people off their rooftops and out of their attics. In many cases, some were bringing them to the dome. Others were bringing them to levees. We had buses being, school buses that we had sent in were picking up people off the highways, any kind of highland where rescuers could figure out might make some sense. They were dropping large groups of people off, elderly with children, and in the hot, hot sun in this miserable, miserable situation. So it was a very difficult sight, I will tell you. And when you thought about the magnitude of loss and that each individual family was going to have to be dealing with this loss, it was a very emotionally difficult thing. It was emotional when people saw their own homes underwater and their furniture and their photo albums and their records and everything about their lives had been ruined. It's just incredible how difficult that is to accept in the United States of America in this day and time, but it happened here.
Also on that day, when you were on the helicopter, you landed actually at the Superdome and spoke with some of the people there. What was that experience like as their governor to walk into the Superdome and speak to them?
Well, the people who actually saw me arrive were so very grateful that I was there. There are a lot of people who were afraid for me to go in, and they were worried that, you know, it'd be dangerous, and all kinds of opinions were being cast out there. And I said, these are our people. I'm not afraid. I'm going to go in there. I have to talk to some of these people. I have to get a feeling for what is, you know, what's going on in their lives right now. Well, and it was a terrible mix of sorrow and fear, and they were so happy to see me, I'll tell you that. But people started telling me how they had put their children on a boat and they didn't have another chair, you know, another place on the boat, but they'd said, here, take my children, I need them to be rescued. And then they didn't know where the children had been dropped off because another boat came along and picked them up, and they got a ride in, and then they couldn't find their children. They couldn't find their families. And one man held his baby up, and apparently he had been in the first group of people who had gone into the dome, and he said, Governor, he said, look at my baby. She hasn't had a bath in 3 days. And he said, I need to get her out of here before she gets sick. And he was right. You know, you're in a bad place when you have an infant with you. So, you know, I talked to them. We gave them water. We tried to give them some assurances that help was truly gonna be there shortly. Unfortunately, it would be another 2 days before the FEMA buses would arrive in significant numbers so that we could have a rational evacuation and get them into safer places where they could settle in and just take care of some basic needs that their families absolutely had to have.
Your former communications director, Bob Mann, told us he wanted to put some reporters on that helicopter with you, but you shot down that suggestion right away. Why was that?
Well, I was concerned that the reporters were wanting to be on boats and planes and everything, and I know they wanted to tell the story, but we had people who had to make clear decisions and understand what was going on. And we flew into the city of New Orleans, and we had a meeting with Mayor Nagin and the FEMA representatives who were there. And we, you know, we had a pretty heavy load of people already. We just really didn't have room for them. And the helicopters that we had, the other helicopters we had, were actually being used for rescue missions. And I just couldn't I just didn't feel right about, photographers being on a rescue helicopter taking the place of one person who needed to be rescued, who needed to be taken to a safer place. And so it was probably not the best decision, because then the national media started making up stories based on what they could see right where they were, and not realizing the impact of our initiatives and the things that we were doing as well. But having said all that, it was about saving lives more than telling stories. It was really about us getting as many people to safety as we possibly could. So from the reality of it, it was the better decision. From the public relations side of it, it could have been better. It might have been better if we'd had a few camera people on board.
One of the figures, and you've mentioned him several times throughout the interview, that was the subject of widespread criticism was Mayor Nagin. What was it like dealing with him in the chaos of this storm?
Mayor Nagin was a mayor who had never served in public office before he became mayor of New Orleans. And he was a peculiar sort in that he didn't trust anybody, and this was before the storm. This was well known about him before the storm. He was suspicious of everybody and everything, and he was hard to communicate with openly and honestly from the beginning. So now you layer on, the storm emotion for him, and his city is destroyed, and he thinks that everybody's a booger-bear, and it became very difficult. And then the communication system went down. So every 504 number that existed was flooded out when the central offices of Bell South got flooded. The central office is not an office building where rooms of people are working. It's the office where all of the phone lines meet and connect to each other so that the world can communicate with people in the 504 district or region. So every 504 number went down when the central office went down, and it was nearly impossible. We could talk on satellite phones to people in Washington, D.C. or Baton Rouge when we were in New Orleans, but we couldn't call anybody who had a phone number that was based in the New Orleans area. So it became very, very difficult. We had liaisons who would try to transmit information to each other. I would go into the city looking for him. Every now and then I could not find him. Sometimes I could find him. And it was tough. And I think he was told by his police chief that people were gunning for him. So he got very afraid and didn't want to come out. Rumors destroy every effort that you have going. You have to keep a clear head. You have to put your emotional life on the shelf, and you have to do clear analysis. And in those days, that's what we needed, and it was the ingredient that was most missing.
Now, Governor Blanco, you were the first female governor in the history of Louisiana, and you also were a Democrat in a state that has become increasingly more and more conservative. Do you think that this complicated your relationship with the Bush White House?
Well, it complicated the White House piece of it, because President Bush had a political person in his office, in the person of Karl Rove. Most presidents and most governors do not put their political people in their office as employees. Those people remain independent advisors, but not as employees. So it was, it had a political tint to everything that came out of the Bush White House. And I think that the unfortunate thing is that President Bush was a very compassionate man, and he was making decisions from his heart as well as his head. But then when the national media started jumping on him and for the delays, and he couldn't get FEMA to produce the desired results in a timely fashion, I would say specifically the buses. And I asked the White House every day if they could possibly get the buses here, and every one of them wanted to do that. But, it seemed like they could not move the bureaucracy in time. It took until Thursday morning. The storm hit on Monday, and FEMA buses finally arrived on Thursday morning. But, you know, I didn't sense the politics of it initially. Because I was dealing with the president directly, and I considered him a very decent, compassionate man. The politics began to unfold in the wake of the attacks that the president was taking. And of course, what is the best way to turn attention from one being attacked? And that's to find another scapegoat. So I became the logical scapegoat, and you know, they went so far as to put a very definitive lie out. Karl Rove told Time magazine, who told me that the information came from him. He told Time magazine and the Washington Post that the reason for the federal delay was that the governor of Louisiana had not signed the disaster declaration till after landfall. Well, we all know it was a lie because every media outlet in Louisiana announced it on Friday night and printed it on Saturday morning. And you know, it just was the lie, the big lie that was used to discredit me. And the lie lived on for several weeks. And you know, I told my people, including Bob Mann, that they needed to quit trying to fight these public relations wars, that the attacks were going to come on me, and let them. I said, we are not going to use our energy to fight a public relations initiative. We're going to save lives. That is our mission. Our mission is to get Louisiana whole, to keep it together, to prevent as many people from dying as we possibly can do. And while they're sitting in air-conditioned offices planning these political strategies that are designed to hurt someone or another. And they were trying to blame Louisiana for everything that went wrong in the storm when we were the absolute victims. And I always found that to be a great irony. And I deeply resented the politicization of this disaster, because you're putting too many lives at risk when you want to play political games. I was never really a partisan person, so I guess that made me a little bit naive toward the level of politics that they were willing to play. And I mean, I intellectually understood politics was going to come into play. I just didn't think it would be as coarse and as dishonest as it actually turned out to be.
Now, Governor, you mentioned earlier, you said that you believed President Bush was a very caring and compassionate man. Do you blame that the federal government bureaucracy and the politicization of this more on the people around him within the White House than the president himself?
Oh, I had many people from Washington who really liked George Bush tell me that there were people around him who did not serve him well. And they were always upset about certain kinds of decisions and announcements that were coming forth in the aftermath of the hurricane. And these were people who deeply cared for the president. And so I wasn't really the only person. You know, this information was coming at me all the time.
Now, Governor, I want to move on a little bit from the storm into the recovery and the aftermath. And I have noticed that you have your New Orleans Saints cup out of the line of our cameras, but after you had some pretty tense negotiations with Mr. Benson and the team before the storm hits, and afterwards word starts circulating throughout the media that he's thinking about moving the team to San Antonio, Texas. You were instrumental in the process of keeping the Saints here in Louisiana. How important was that?
Well, we had some big decisions to make, and one of them was to try to keep the Saints. The other was to determine what to do with the dome. Mr. Benson had been pushing Louisiana to build a new stadium. He wanted an open-air stadium for a number of years. He told me that when I was lieutenant governor, when I helped him to recruit for a Super Bowl in New Orleans. And he really was getting less and less happy. Other teams were getting new stadiums, and he thought that would cure his ills. And I said, Mr. Benson, my husband's a football coach, and I know what will cure your ills. You know, he wanted more support from the business community in New Orleans and from the fans. And I said, you start having more wins than losses, and you'll have lots and lots of support. And it's not about the dome. You know, it's about what happens on the field. But, you know, that was then, and then this was now, and I became governor, and he was still pushing for that new stadium. That was one of his goals. And then the storm came along and destroyed the facility. Now, our contract said that we had to provide a facility for him, for his team to play. And here we were without a facility. First of all, we didn't know if the dome could be reclaimed. We had to know that its foundation was still firm and that it had not been compromised, or it could be dangerous. So I asked that an analysis, an engineering analysis, be done to determine if the building had been compromised. And Doug Thornton, who was the manager of the building for SMG, the contractor, saw to that and brought me the results, and he said, "Governor, good news. The building has not been compromised. It's possible that we could maybe bring it back." And I said, "Well, Doug, let me ask you this. You know, Benson is talking to San Antonio. San Antonio was courting him. They definitely wanted a team there. And he had businesses there, so it was a pretty natural extension." And I said, "What if we lose the Saints? I mean, how long do you think this will take to get the building up?" He said, "Well, every square inch of it was in need of cleaning, repairing, restoration, and it would take about 2 years." And I said, "In 2 years, I mean, this is a business for Tom Benson. He's not going to be able to wait 2 years." And he had a very bad experience playing in the LSU stadium. His team did not play well, and he left early, and a reporter confronted him as he was leaving the stadium, and he said some very difficult things. And I saw him after, and he was very, very upset. So, you know, all of this emotion that so many people who lost their businesses were experiencing was reflected in Tom Benson's loss of his own business facility. And so we had to determine whether or not, if I made the decision to go forward and we lost the Saints, could the Superdome still make money? And we determined yes, that it could, you know, it had enough activity in between the games, although it's made to be a stadium, you know, for an NFL football team. But we made the decision to go forward, and I took huge criticism from many, many ranks. She's got the wrong priorities. All of these people don't have homes. What is she doing pushing money into the dome at this point in time? October, it was like 6 weeks after the storm, we made that decision to go forward. It was, the naysayers were loud and strong, but I determined that that building with its ripped roof had been the symbol of despair, and we needed to get it straight. We needed to get it repaired so that it could be the symbol of victory. It was just a few weeks after that, after we made the decision, that Paul Tagliabue contacted me. And he said, "Governor, I see that y'all have made the decision to go forward with the renovation." He said, "Let me tell you this. If you can get it done in 9 months, if you can get it game ready for the first regular game of 2006, which I think was September 24th, he said, I will guarantee you that Tom Benson will not leave the city. This NFL team, the Saints, will not leave New Orleans." He said, "I cannot imagine anything worse than for the NFL to leave one of its cities, one of its good, loyal cities, in the midst of its most dramatic and difficult days." And he said that would really be a black eye for the NFL. And he said, "So if you can get it done, I can guarantee you that I can hold Tom Benson off for that length of time." And I said, "We will do our level best." And Doug Thornton came over, and Tim Coulon, who was head of the Superdome Commission that I had appointed a board to, and Tim was the chairman of the board, and they came over, and Doug looked at me, and he had heard the same message, and he said, "Governor, I don't know how we're going to do it." He said, "But we will do our level best," because again, it was a 2-year project by any normal reckoning, and now we had a 9-month deadline, and it was miraculously done, just miraculously done. the architects, the engineers, the workforce, every single piece of the work had to be done exactly on time to accomplish the goal, and we did it. And it was the most exciting game that I think Louisiana will ever experience, ever in our history, and maybe the most exciting game of the entire NFL. Because when I went into the city that afternoon before the game, the people on the streets were so highly energized. I just felt like they looked like they were walking 12 inches off the ground, just sort of floating. They were so excited. People were jumping up and down and hugging, and it was a huge reunion for so many people. And the idea was, here for the last year, people had been working so hard to bring their properties up and to put their businesses back together and their homes back together, and to make these very hard decisions and try to get contractors, when costs were suddenly escalated by 1/3 because of the demand, and materials were hard to come by. Everything was working against them. But this was a day where they could stop their work, stop everything they were doing, and come to see this huge building that had been technically finished in 9 months. And then have a team that responded to all of this joy and all of this celebration with the most magnificent win. It was a very exciting, wonderful occasion. And as that day wore on, that's when the apologies began. And all the critics were either contacting me or just publicly stating, she was right, we were wrong. She could look into the future. We couldn't see the forest for the trees, and it was those big things, those big building blocks that we had to keep in place or put in place to have a rational recovery. And that was my job. And I knew when I made the decision, it was going to bring lots of criticism my way. And I just figured I was strong enough to take it. And that in the end, they would say she was right, and that's exactly what happened. And that happened on more than one front. It happened in education. It happened in our wars with Congress trying to get sufficient money. It happened everywhere. We fought and fought and fought for the right things to happen. And I worked until the last days of my being governor. I never quit because it was such a big challenge, such a big, big piece of work that had to be done. And then I turned it over to another governor, and I sighed a deep sigh of relief knowing that I had done every single thing that I could possibly do, that I could possibly bring forth. And I think that my work stands and speaks loudly for itself.
You talk about working up until the last moments that you were governor. In 2007, you have a televised address and you tell the state that you will not seek a second term. At the point when you made that address, you had been in public office for 23 years. How hard of a call was that to make personally?
That was a call, well, the decision had been made months before. I knew that I was not going to run, but I was concerned if I announced it too soon that as a lame duck governor, I might not be as effective as a serving governor. So I worried about it both ways. But then in that period in March, we were now trying to effect a responsible recovery and trying to get the right things in place. And I needed the legislature to be more cooperative and less political. And I just decided that the way to take the steam out of their partisan politics was simply to tell them, to share with them my decision that I was not going to run again. And it did. All of a sudden, they treated my concepts, my ideas, as genius ideas, as opposed to, oh, how horrible politics, such terrible decisions. No, everything began to make sense to them once they once the political prism was removed and they could see things for its own value. A couple of hardy souls still didn't want the governor, the Democratic governor, to have credit for things, but you know, when you're governor, you get the credit, you get the blame, you get everything. And we were able to really get a lot of cooperation then from the legislature. And it was smooth sailing legislatively, except, you know, when they tried to give away the tax base, and I had to veto about 6 tax bills at the end of the session so that the next governor would have a sound fiscal situation. But anyway, it was a pretty interesting time. You know, I just knew that I was experiencing some health concerns, and that if I didn't get myself out of it, that nobody was going to take care of me but me. And you know, the public doesn't concern itself with the health of a governor. You know, they expect you to be whole, and they expect you to be doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that's pretty much how you have to operate. So, you know, I knew that I needed to remove myself for my personal reasons and for the political sailing to be smoother. It worked both ways.
You talk about your successor, Bobby Jindal. I want to take you back for a minute to the 2003 election. During the course of the campaign, you ran an ad featuring the retired neurologist Dr. Evan Howell, who spoke very candidly in the ad about the cuts Bobby Jindal enacted when he was the head of the Louisiana Health and Hospitals Department. Seeing what has happened with the state's budget and funding overall in the last 8 years, are you surprised? And do you feel that what you said during that campaign has been proven?
Well, Dr. Howell had had a personal experience with Bobby Jindal when he was head of the Department of Health and Hospitals for Louisiana. And his prediction was 100% right. He understood what Bobby Jindal's mission was and actually turned out to be, and that was the destruction of the LSU hospital system. And you know, there were many voices always wanting privatization, and there was a path to privatization, but not really the path that Governor Jindal took. When you turn down the Medicaid money, and then the money that you normally get from the federal government is drying up, you need to have your head examined. And to put it bluntly, it's a very bad decision, and he made his decisions based on his politics and not on good common sense and what the people of Louisiana need.
How would you rate his performance as governor the last 8 years? You seemed very critical. You've been in the job, you understand the stresses.
I had great hopes for Bobby Jindal. I never wish bad on a leader. I know that if the governor succeeds, Louisiana succeeds. If the president succeeds, the country succeeds. So I had great hopes for Bobby Jindal. I wanted to see him succeed. And I find him to be an abject disappointment.
Now, you were the vice chairwoman of the 2004 Democratic National Convention. Do you think he's a viable presidential candidate?
No, I don't think he's viable. I think that he's very ambitious. And I think that ambition is what got in the way of him being a good governor. If he had not so desired to be president and taken the bent, he took the ultimate Republican principles to their nth degree and applied them to Louisiana. And he has destroyed the funding for higher education. He's making it very, very, very difficult for people to get higher degrees now because of the costs that now families and individuals have to bear in a state that needs as many educated people as we can possibly get. His angles and his goals were totally wrong for Louisiana. But, you know, perfect Republican principles at work, just, you know, badly delivered, 100% delivered though. And now we see the fruits of his labor have made life miserable for so many.
Now, we are in the thick of the 2015 gubernatorial campaign, which is just a couple of months away. And we have the 4 major candidates, Senator David Vitter, John Bell Edwards, Jay Darden, and Scott Angel. As a former governor, kind of watching the race, has anybody in particular captured your attention?
Well, I think that it's very interesting to watch this race. I see that our United States Senator David Vitter, who always told Governor Jindal he wasn't cutting deeply enough. Seems to be leading in some polls lately, not leading, but I just wonder, which of the three will be the least like Bobby Jindal, and that's the person I want. And and I don't want anyone who's going to be similar to him, to his level of governance. It's wrong for Louisiana.
Now, former Mayor Ray Nagin, who you spoke with at length during this interview, and you dealt with at length during Katrina, is currently serving a 10-year prison sentence for corruption that occurred during his time in office. You said he ran during 2002 as a reformer. Were you surprised when he was convicted, charged, and sent to prison?
I was surprised. I guess I never expected Mayor Nagin to be worrying about personal benefit, and I was badly mistaken. I knew that, that he could have been a better mayor in some respects, but I thought that he was really working hard for his city and working in his own way, and I didn't judge him for that. I thought that, in his own way, he was doing what he knew how to do, just as I knew in my own way what needed to be done for the state. But at the same time, I was extremely disappointed and surprised when I first learned about his involvement in personal gain.
Your former Lieutenant Governor, Mitch Landrieu, is now the current mayor of New Orleans. He'll be presiding over many of the ceremonies to mark the Katrina anniversary this weekend. How would you rate his performance as mayor so far?
I think that Mitch Landrieu is doing an excellent job as mayor of a city that needed a good, clear eye, less emotional point of view, although a deeply caring person. I think that Mitch has a lot of good tools. He knows how to use them. He's gotten the federal government to help him in many ways, and will continue to do so because he's smart and energetic and he knows what he's doing. So I think the city is definitely thriving under his leadership, and he recognizes that the mission is not yet complete, that the recovery still has a way to go for some people.
I want to round out with two general questions. In 20, 30 years down the line, when historians look back at Katrina, when they look back at your time at governor, what do you think their assessment of Kathleen Blanco will be?
I think history's already been rewritten, and I think the real story is coming forward. As I told my staff, the truths will be there. We here in Louisiana are the people who saved Louisiana people. All of us working together as one huge team put our shoulders to the grindstone and did everything we could, everything humanly possible that we could think of doing it. And I had lots of very smart people all around me, and together we knew what needed to be done, and we did it. We are the people who deserve the most credit and who are the actual heroes. There are thousands of us, not just me. There are just thousands of us who work so hard and work day and night. My own personal staff, and the department heads and the people down in the ranks of state government didn't see their families. I had mothers and fathers who had children who didn't see them for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, and children who were worried sick for the safety of their parents because they were seeing all these images, not really knowing where their parents were sometimes, and if they were in the danger zones, and if, but they were just working so hard that, we all look back and we're all war weary for sure. And for many, it's a hard story to think about, to tell, because for all the hard work that we did, all the heavy lifting that we did, we saw things slipping between our fingers that we couldn't stop, and we couldn't go back and pick up in that moment. And somebody else had, we had to find somebody else to come and pick up those pieces, and it just became, it was that big. It just became so hard to hold it all together. That's why it took so many of us working day and night. We had 18-hour days for months and months and months. I had an exhausted core of people working so hard to to try to bring some sanity to the chaos, to try to make the world work again for all those who had lost their homes and their livelihoods. And it's a big, big job. You know, we all think about our destinies, and we don't really know what our final destinies are going to be like. But when God puts you in a place where there's a big load of work to be done, all you can do is put your shoulder to the grindstone and get at it, and start picking up every single piece that you can possibly pick up, and just keep going back until it's all done. And that's the story of what we did, and that's how we did it. And you know, we have regrets because we couldn't do it fast enough. We couldn't do it 100% enough. We did it. We did all of it. But it just seemed like a tortuously slow process because of the magnitude.
You talk about your staff, the people around you. Aside from the historians, aside from the outside critics, at the end of the day, what do you personally want the legacy of Kathleen Blanco to be to the people of Louisiana and to this state?
Well, I want the people of Louisiana to know that I truly love Louisiana people. I love my state, and my goal always was to help lift my state, to lift our people, to give them the best educations possible, to give them the best opportunities possible. And in our work, we did a lot of that. We did it as well as conditions would allow us to. And I do believe that from those perspectives, our work has proven to be a good benefit, a good thing for Louisiana. People saw the caring, and they understood that I wanted them to have the best of everything that life has to offer. And that's what I worked for.
Former Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco, thank you very much, Governor.